Welcome to the Family Farm Defenders podcast, where we talk with those on the front lines of building a just food and farming system. And in this episode, we're discussing the state of international agricultural trade. Now, I'm your host, Raj Patel. I'm a research professor at the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And we're joined today by two fantastic guests who see this issue from altogether all angles. Let's begin with you, Karen. So, Karen Hansen-Kuhn, would you care to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Director of Trade and International Policies at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. IATP was formed during a farm crisis back in the 80s. And so since then, we've been looking at the causes of farm crises, both in the US and in other countries. I have been working on NAFTA issues since their inception, really, quite a long time, and always thinking about how this affects our food system, but also with our trading partners. You know, what are the solutions that can work better for everyone?
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, IATP, for the work that you've been doing over so many years. And Karen and I are joined by Jim Goodman, surely no stranger to anyone who's been listening to this podcast, but nonetheless, assuming we've pulled in new listeners for this episode, Jim, I wonder if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Raj. And thank you, Karen, both of you for being here. I'm Jim Goodman. I'm a retired organic dairy farmer from southwestern Wisconsin. And while I haven't been as intimately involved in the details of international trade and understanding what it's all about as Karen and Raj have, I guess I could say, as all farmers, I've been a victim of faulty trade policies, perhaps ever since the colonial days when Britain ruled us with an iron hand and decided what we would trade and how much we would make from it. But in many ways, things haven't gotten much better for farmers. In fact, for small farmers, it's worse because now we pretty much depend on international trade to soak up all the excess production that we produce. And it's not a good avenue for small farmers to make a living, for them even to stay on the land. So I think with the explanations we might hear today about the USMCA and NAFTA and WTO, we can get a better understanding as to why farmers have suffered so much under these unfair trade policies that are called free, but certainly have never been fair.
Well, thank you, Jim. And I mean, you're absolutely right, of course. The whole notion of taking on a discussion about trade policy is terrifying. And it's appropriate that we are recording on Halloween. So this is Friday, October 31st, 2025. And I mention that because, I mean, as with anything in the Trump administration, the day you record something, it's absolutely turned around the day afterwards because of the lunacy of this particular administration. But today's a particularly interesting day because we're coming off the back of the Trump-Xi meetings in Asia. And perhaps we can start by just zooming out and hearing from both of you about the big picture around trade policy. So actually, Jim, I mean, you were starting to tell us a little bit about that anyway. So maybe I can toss it over to you first. But we'll start from the ground up and from your experiences of how trade policy. Obviously, it's a bit bonkers at the moment, but I wonder if you might be able to set it into context for us.
Well, as I mentioned, small farmers have been going out, farms have been getting bigger, producing more commodities, chief among those corn and soybeans. And we're told to produce more and more because exports are what drives our agricultural economy. The problem with that is someone has to be willing to take it. And that may not always be the case. We've seen that with dairy products that we want to force into Canada. Right now, soybeans are the big item. In that China has basically not bought any soybeans this year, where they used to be responsible for buying probably somewhere around 45% of all our production. So when you lose basically half your market, what happens with that? And we depend on international trade to soak that all up. There's never been a question that maybe we should think about how much we're produced to meet domestic demands, and if other countries want to buy from us, fill that demand as well, rather than producing as much as we possibly can, where the farmer gets paid as little as possible for it, usually, if he's even profitable, pennies per bushel, and hope that someone will buy it from us. And with the dairy, of course, a few years ago, we were trying to force Canada to take more dairy product, which made sense to some farmers because they're producing more than we can sell domestically. But Canada has a pretty good support price mechanism for farmers, production controls, and Wisconsin alone produces more dairy than Canada. If we were to force them to take more production, basically all we do is put a lot of their farmers out of business without really helping Wisconsin farmers. So just those two things in agriculture, soybeans and dairy, show that our trade policies are really flawed and haven't helped small farmers here, because we've been losing small farmers year after year after year. And it's really not benefiting us. It's benefiting big processors, but it's not helping small farmers anywhere in the world. And I think most farmers realize that we're all in this together, and one group of farmers tearing another one down doesn't help anyone.
Thanks for that, Jim. I mean, and I wonder, Karen, then if you might be able to square the circle for our listeners who will, if they are farmers or comrades of farmers, will often hear the rhetoric about how this particular administration or every previous administration has always been a friend of the farmer, and American trade policy is there to help farmers feed the world, and America is this great, it's a shining city on a hill that's ready to send food to the parts of the world that need it, and trade policy is just one of the many ways in which America is making the world great again. So how do you square the rhetoric around trade policy helping farmers with what you've seen over the course of your career? And I wonder if, as you answer that, you might be able to share what's particularly different about this administration.
Well, I would say, I completely agree with Jim. The whole premise has been that farmers need to produce as much as possible, even if the prices go really low, and that they make up in volume with these exports. And so the whole system depends on exporting. ITP has calculated the extent to which our exports are sold at below the cost of production, dumping, for many years. And there have been some ups and downs. When food prices get really high, there's less dumping. But over time, there has been this consistent pattern of our exports disrupting other markets. It was really clear in Mexico. Once NAFTA came into force, we quadrupled our corn exports to Mexico, and millions of Mexican farmers were driven out of agriculture. But the thing that sometimes doesn't get picked up is this is bad for farmers in other countries, but it's bad for farmers in this country as well, because the corporations, the agribusinesses that control all the exports, are the ones who are taking profits at different points in the supply chain. So then they gain more power, less power to farmers in this country. So we have greater corporate concentration here, farmers locked into a particular system, and disruption in other countries. I guess one point I would make before, as we proceed, is when we talk about trade, we're talking both about the tariffs, which are in the news all the time anymore, which are a sort of tax, and the rules that underlie them. The trade agreements set a lot of rules that say it is unfair discrimination if you do certain things. If you last year with Mexico wanted to restrict imports of GM corn. That was deemed unfair and unscientific, and Mexico lost a trade dispute about it. So we have both this whole set of rules in these agreements. And I will say, the agreements are explicitly set out to facilitate flows of trade, to facilitate flows of goods and services and investments across countries. They are not set up to promote sustainable development. That's not what they were designed for. Now, we can change them. And of course, they are rules. They are not carved in stone. But that's the starting premise. So that's why we get these kind of results. I think what's different this time is before this, earlier administrations believed in rules, right? And now things are changing all the time. It's hard. I don't know if you've looked, there are different tariff trackers online. The tariffs that Trump says we're charging change like day to day. And so it's hard to keep track of what those tariffs will be. And so that too is really disruptive for farmers everywhere, not knowing what's coming. So that is a big difference now that, Trump is using a lot of instruments that hadn't really been used that way before. And there's some things coming up about that. But basically it comes down to saying, he's not going to respect the rules, essentially. Now, they are fundamentally bad rules in a lot of cases. So it's not that we're saying, we should stick with USMCA because it got everything right. But I do think there's a real risk if we think that the alternatives are Trump's approach versus free trade, that we get people starting to defend the existing agreements because it seems like the only option. Ideally, it opens some space for us to redefine what it needs to be.
Let me play devil's advocate here then, because at some level, a lot of the ideas that certainly the three of us have been throwing around have been around, well, we would like sustainable development. What's sustainable? Well, people in the US have to consume a little less. We can't have 10, 12 dolls. Maybe we just have one. And that's exactly what Trump said, right? That actually, in a society of overconsumption, perhaps we need to curtail our consumption. One of the ways of doing that is by making things more expensive, and tariffs do that. So I just wanted to suggest that if there were some lefty president who came in and started taking 10% of large corporations and started selling pharmaceuticals directly and encouraged us for the national good to consume a little less, that wouldn't necessarily be entirely a bad thing. Sure.
No, but if you think about like what we are exporting and what we're producing, we export, as Jim said, a lot of corn and soy. A lot of these commodity crops, our farm system is set up around that. On the other hand, we have a huge trade deficit in agriculture because we're importing a lot more fruits and vegetables. Those are the kinds of things that could be subject to these tariffs. Do we want to cut that consumption? I don't think we do. But the solution will not be just around the trade measures. It would be shifting incentives within Farm Bill programs as well. So I think it comes down to thinking about what we need. And I would say we need to eat less meat. We need to consume a whole lot less biofuels, I would say. And we need to consume more fruits and vegetables. But we don't have the policies set up to make that happen. And so that's where we need changes.
Can I ask Jim where you're seeing that we need the changes as well?
Well, that's Karen makes a really good point, and I don't know how many years we'd have to go back to say when this all began. We shifted our agricultural system from actual food production to commodity production, but it's been a long time. And last week we drove across Minnesota to South Dakota, and you look at these farms, and if you see cattle on pasture, that's kind of a rare sight anymore. Basically, all you see is corn and soybeans. And you wonder what alternative these farmers have, because they're so tied into that production of corn and soybeans year after year after year, always producing more with machinery that's so big, it wouldn't even fit through the gates on our farm. And this is where we are. We have a system that's geared to huge, massive commodity production and export. The production of fruit and vegetables, like Karen talks about, we rely on Mexico and South and Central America pretty much. And it's kind of the same in Europe, I think, that they depend on countries other than the big grain producing countries in Europe to feed them. And, we talk about we feed the world. Well, we may feed the world's livestock production that are mostly housed in CAFOs, but we're not really producing food for people. And I think we need to look at some way of clawing back to where we're actually producing food through local regional food production systems and get off this commodity bandwagon, because from a farmer's point of view, it's not helping us. We're losing farmers. From a consumer point of view, they don't really know exactly where their food comes from, and they're depending on farmers in other parts of the world to feed them. That's not the message we get, because we're feeding the world, but that's not the case.
Well, Karen and Jim, thanks so much for giving us the sort of big picture here and a sense of who the winners and losers are. And I wonder if we can actually now start making this concrete, given that as we record, Trump has met with President Xi in South Korea, and the news is that the US is starting to buy US soybeans, now committing to 25 million tons. So from the perspective of from the farm gate, is this mission accomplished? Are we heading back to normal now?
Well, I guess that depends what you consider to be normal. They may be buying close, I guess, to the average, or committing to buy close to the average of the past several years. Certainly not the amount that we would like to sell, because they're buying 40% of our production, and a lot of it is still looking for a market somewhere. Not that there aren't other countries that would want to buy that, but as I said before, we never question whether we're producing too much, and we depend on those countries to soak up what we're producing. China says they're going to go back to 25 million metric tons for the next 3 years. After that, we don't know what'll happen. For this marketing year, I think it's like 12 million metric tons they're going to purchase. That's a little less than half of what they normally do. So basically, we're looking at 12 to 15 metric tons that we don't have a market for. Farmers have told me, and I've seen the big piles of corn across Minnesota, but other farmers have said they've seen grain buyers piling soybeans outside. And anyone that knows anything about soybeans, you really can't do that unless you have some pretty good conditions to do it, because soybeans absorb a lot of moisture. You could be asking for a giant pile of soybeans to suck up that moisture and go bad over winter, and then you've got nothing. And the price that I think China has committed to pay is a little bit over the market price at Chicago, which is good. They're paying a couple dollars more per bushel, but that price means the farmer has to get his soybeans to that market for the price they're paying. Soybeans to China are generally shipped probably out of West Coast ports. So even if they're getting $2 over the Chicago price, which barely or probably doesn't meet the cost of production, they still have to pay for getting them to the West Coast and then from there to China. Someone's paying that, and it's probably not the grain companies, because they're going to make a profit no matter what happens. So again, the farmers, even though it looks like we're going to be, or the soybean farmers are going to have a market, is it a profitable market? I doubt it. I really doubt it.
One thing I would add.
So yeah, go ahead.
Just to add to that, when I was looking up the results of that meeting yesterday, one thing I noticed inside U.S. Trade, which is a kind of industry publication, in their reporting on this issue, they said China's readout mentioned only that the two sides agreed to expand agricultural trade. And so there, with a lot of these deals that have been made over time, like with Japan and other countries, we here in the U.S., these contracts have been made essentially, but the other countries are saying, well, no, it's a little softer than that. And I would guess that's in some part because things have been changing in the US as well. I'm not saying China is lying, but I'm saying it may be that there is expectations. I would want to see what those final readouts actually say, what the commitments actually are. I would also point out one thing I hadn't realized: China has 40 million metric tons in soy reserves. So they can afford to wait things out if they want to. I mean, Jim would tell you too, I think reserves is a really great idea. We should have grain reserves here as well. So they are in a position, both because they can import from other countries and because they've got their own reserves, they're in a position to kind of wait and see how this all plays out, at least on that.
So, I mean, is this part of, is farming really just a bargaining chip so that Trump can get a better deal on TikTok and some rare earth minerals? I mean, is that what agriculture has been reduced to now?
I don't know if we really know, but, there is a big dispute about the U.S. selling computer chips to China. I don't know what this trade deal had to say about that, but one can't help but think there was a give and take that they benefited and we benefited. And I guess you have to ask the question, if anyone in the administration really understands how trade and tariffs work. It seems that they think it's all about us and we get what we want and everyone else has to give it to us. But in reality, it doesn't work that way. And I can only imagine that China and other countries that he talked with are getting something out of this change in tariffs, trade, change in commodities and whatever that we're not hearing about.
Does that sound right to you, Karen?
I think that's right. I mean, I think it's unfortunate. It's all comes across as this zero-sum game. It should be a more collaborative approach. That's what the idea is behind these, but that's not what's happening. So, but we don't know, and lack of transparency is a big problem in all of this.
Well, let's get back to the trade agreement that we're here in North America most intimately bound up with, which is what is what now the USMCA, what was once NAFTA, and which you've studied pretty deeply, Karen. I mean, even that agreement was in some ways very opaque from the get-go, and even though it sort of had the veneer of being democratically negotiated under Clinton and under PRI in Mexico. Farmers were sold out by their democratically elected government. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the journey that NAFTA has taken and what what it is now that we might be able democratically to achieve if all of a sudden the rules are up in play. Are there things that we can and should be fighting for, at least in that agreement, that we might be able to change?
Well, I hope so. I think it's a question I get all the time because we are working on this USMCA review. Like, will he just cancel it? Will it just be declared done after a few days? And we don't know. But I think it gets back to the question of, as I said, it's not just Trump's ideas versus free trade agreements. It's us defining what we want, starting from what we have, I guess, and moving forward. When NAFTA was negotiated, it had, as I said, it had some pretty bad impacts on Mexican farmers. That's something that continues to this day. And since then, during the first Trump administration, he declared it a disaster and renegotiated, and certain things were changed. In agriculture, there were some new provisions added to sort of facilitate approvals of ag biotech. There was some good things that happened in USMCA. There were some new provisions on labor rights, a rapid response mechanism where there can be complaints targeted at factories that are violating labor rights. They greatly weakened investor state dispute mechanism, which is a tool that allows investors to sue governments over measures that impact on their expected profits. It's a very unfair provision, and it's not quite gone, but it was greatly weakened for the first time. So there were a few things that were good, and so I think different groups now are trying to build on that in this review to say, well, what do we have? What needs to change? It is, of course, a dilemma for everyone. Like, do we believe this is moving forward? It's hard to know. But I think for now, it makes sense for us to say what we want, and keep moving forward. And our audience is broader than just the Trump administration. I think we're hoping that in some future, where Congress is deliberating or we're thinking about new trade arrangements, we'd have some new ideas. But in any case, what's happening now with the review, something that was mandated when the USMCA was formed, is after 6 years, the three governments have to do a review. That started in July. It'll go through this July. And at that point, they decide either to extend it for another 16 years or to start a 10-year process of reviews where they would ultimately withdraw from the agreement. So we work within Citizens Trade Campaign, a multi-sectoral coalition, and we signed a letter that went out in June that was signed by nearly 700 groups calling for reforms, calling for changes that go beyond anything that's been dealt with before, and concluding that if they don't make these changes, they should withdraw. At this point in the process, there is request for comments at USTR. So different groups are making submissions. Some of those are technical submissions. There are a lot that are very short submissions, people saying the one thing they want changed. And I think we can expect hundreds or thousands of those kind of submissions, really trying to change the debate a little bit. That ends on Monday. People can make submissions. And then from there, we'll see how the whole process proceeds.
And I mean, can you give us a sense of what it is that y'all are asking for?
Well, so we made a submission, ITP made a submission with the National Family Farm Coalition and the Western Organization of Resource Councils. And so, we start out acknowledging the broader requests in the big civil society group. We endorse those things, strengthening labor and environmental rights. But on agriculture, we focused on 3 areas. One is to improve transparency in food labels. One issue that's been very contentious over the last decade or so is country of origin labeling for meat. And this has been a real priority for farm groups. Meat is produced in ways, it's an integrated market now where the animal might cross the border several times. It's hard for consumers to know where the meat they buy was actually produced. And knowing that, it gives consumers more information. It gives U.S. farmers a chance to perhaps get a better price and to break some of the corporate stranglehold on the pricing mechanisms. So we had country of origin labeling for meat. We have it still for fruits and vegetables. But back in 2009, Canada and Mexico challenged the U.S. on that policy at the WTO. There were a series of back and forth, but in the end, in 2015, the final panel ruled that the program was discriminatory and that it was the record keeping was too expensive. And the Congress responded by eliminating COOL. We were also facing at that point, the WTO had said that Canada or Mexico could give $1 billion in retaliatory tariffs if it continued. So it was withdrawn. There are a lot of reasons why that decision was flawed. And there have been bills in Congress since then to restore country of origin labeling. And a lot of them would include a clause that would say, on the trade piece, USDA and USTR should work out an approach that would fit within the WTO rules. Well, as we looked at it, we realized the problem is not COOL. The problem is the trade rules. And so in this submission, we say that that transparency in food labeling is a really important issue. It's important in Mexico as well. They have a new food law that calls for GMO labeling and better nutrition labeling, things the U.S. has pushed back on. We should say that there should be a peace clause on labeling issues. Transparency is an important issue. The 3 countries could agree not to sue each other over labeling issues, but to continue discussions about how they might resolve this issue. And we have some background on why that would be a reasonable thing to do. A second issue we focused on is seeds. USMCA requires the signatory countries to sign UPOV 91, which is this treaty protecting plant breeders' rights and seeds that basically prohibits farmers from saving and sharing seeds. It is an issue, especially in developing countries around the world, as farmers try to implement agroecological systems, because making that commitment means they cannot, share their innovative seeds. And there's a lot of pressure against them. So this was something we heard from a lot of partners, and especially made sense to our partners in Mexico, where they have ratified an earlier version of that treaty that still allowed for some flexibility, and they've been resisting ever since. And then the third issue is to develop new solutions to overproduction. And this is, as Jim was mentioning, focusing in part on Canada's dairy supply management system, that we should stop initiating trade disputes against Canada over that. We should, Trump has complained about the tariff on that. We should stop those kinds of disputes and instead form a commission to study it. That system's not perfect, but we could learn some things. We could figure out a new approach that might offer some solutions. And that's something that farm groups have been doing. National Family Farm Coalition a few years ago advanced a bill that would, with a proposal on those issues. So those were the three issues we focused on in our submission.
Well, thanks for that, Karen. In fact, Jim, I wonder if you might be able to tell us a little bit about that, because it sounds like the intervention that the US is making in the Canadian dairy market is all of these issues tied together, because Canadians know where the origin of this milk is from. It's directly affecting their rights to be able to be sovereign in their policy setting. And it sounds like actually that there's a great deal to learn from the Canadian supply management system there. And I wonder if you can explain to us why it's worth studying and defending.
Well, as Karen said, a lot of these things aren't perfect, and Canada's dairy policy is not perfect either. But the thing it has done is it's kept small farmers in dairy. They haven't gone to a system like we have, where we've lost so many small farms, and now basically all we have left are huge, multi-thousand cow herds. It's limited their production, and the amount of milk for cheese and everything else that Canada needs is decided every year by a panel made up of farmers and the grocery stores, and they decide how much they're going to need, and then they allot each farmer how much he's going to produce, and they're guaranteed a living fair wage for doing that. They do accept imports from the US, capped at a certain level, and if it goes over that level, yeah, the tariffs are really high, but we've never hit that level. They'd like to, and they'd like the tariffs to go away. And I think that the mention of Mexico not wanting our GM corn, or not wanting to be forced to buy that and the sprays and chemicals that go with it. It's not just American consumers that would like to know where their food comes from and know that it's produced by their farmers. Canadians, Mexicans, Central Americans, it's the same thing. Everyone wants to support their own people. And we don't think that is the way it ought to be, I guess. At least our government, and certainly the big corporations that produce the seed and chemicals and fertilizers, don't want it to be that way, because they want to sell as much as they can and make a profit off buying and selling, buying cheap beef from wherever, selling expensive inputs. It's the system that's just kind of gotten out of control, as we've all said, to the benefit not of consumers or farmers, but to the big multinational grain dealers and meat processors that make a profit no matter what happens.
Well, actually, and I mean, this cross-border issue is part of this geopolitical grand game. And I wonder if I could just ask a sort of final contextual question here about another part of the world, about Indonesia, where apparently there's been a memorandum of understanding for them to increase US milk imports. Now, I mean, given everything that we've discussed about our unstable policies, why would they do this? Wouldn't an agreement with someplace like New Zealand's Fonterra make more sense? I'm wondering if we're thinking about places that are going to take US milk exports, if not Canada, and Indonesia turns out to be one of them. That seems rather improbable. I'm wondering if you all might be able to read the tea leaves on that.
I certainly can't. I was hoping Karen could answer that question for me.
I don't know. I will say the biggest export destination for U.S. dairy is Mexico. I mean, way above Canada. I don't know the answer to that. It does seem illogical. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, when I was looking at it, it did seem to be a sort of rare earths moment where if one's thinking about US strategic sort of diversification, then there could be a sort of quid pro quo in which, in exchange for accepting U.S. dairy imports, there may be some sort of Trumpian inflow of investment in the infrastructure that's required to extract the things that Indonesians, wealthy Indonesians, might be able to profit from and sell back to the United States. But it feels like there is something going on in the grand game here that perhaps we can talk about on a future show. Well, one doesn't. It's we've just cut this this conversation, and off camera we were talking about how between the three of us we have no idea what's going on, and that I mean that does feel to be in many ways how it is that many of us in the United States are feeling about the current policy administration, but there are things that we do know, and I wonder if we can pivot to that and pivot even perhaps more deeply into the discussion that's really just been underlying everything that we've been saying really from the get-go, which is, look, if we had a chance to write the kinds of trade policy and the kind of production policy that we would love to see, and if we could start essentially from scratch, what would we like to see a future, President AOC / Mamdani administration bring to trade policy that's not on the agenda right now? And let me start with you, Jim. I mean, if you had your druthers and you've seen the grand arc of how, as you said at the beginning, trade policy has never really been a friend of American farmers, and has driven American farmers towards these regimes of overproduction. What sorts of policies do you think are going to build those bonds of solidarity between farmers and workers around the world in a way that the current trade regime doesn't?
Well, there's a lot of I think good, maybe not trade policy, but good farm production policy enacted back in the 30s with the first Farm Bill, with parity pricing, farmer-owned grain reserves, and that all pretty much was unraveled by the 1980s. But there's a lot of years in there where farmers were guaranteed a fair price for what they produced. We look back on the 50s as being the time when America built its middle class, and that wasn't just farmers that were doing well, but people who were working in manufacturing or all sorts of businesses in the country. Things were a lot fairer then. There wasn't this income inequity that we see now. And so I think that would be a place to look back and say, some of those policies that parity pricing that were enacted during the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration, which in a way kind of mimic Canada's dairy policy, we need to look at those. We need to discuss ways that we can do that. I think that rather than producing for a world market, we need to look at producing for ourselves and producing things that other people might want to buy, but not forcing them to buy. We all drink coffee in this country. We don't grow a lot of it. So things like that, we're happy to buy from other countries, but we certainly don't need to try and force our GM grains that other countries don't want, or our beef or chicken that are produced with a lot of hormones that other countries don't want. So it's I think trade policy in general has become a way to enrich the multinational corporations that do the trading, and it doesn't give people the choice that they want. It doesn't give farmers the choice that they want, and it certainly doesn't, I don't think, bode well for food security in any nation when you become dependent on another part of the world or another specific country for producing something you really need but really can't produce. So, there are ways that I think everyone can benefit through trade, but we're not discussing them. And I think the main reason is profitability of the big processors, the big grain buyers that don't really care where they buy or where they sell, as long as they can do the buying cheaply and the selling to make a huge profit. And that just makes everyone, farmers, workers, consumers, just pawns in this big machine that at some point, maybe to echo Mary Osawa, we have to say enough and throw ourselves in the gears and stop it.
Well, and Karen, I mean, you've been a giant in this field for decades. I mean, and again, this sort of blank slate question maybe is a little unfair, but I mean, if you had your, if you were the USTR, what would you be doing under President AOC?
Well, I agree with a lot of the things Jim has said, and he has been a leader in a lot of this thinking. I say generally we need to start from our goals. Our goals are not just smooth the way for trade. Our goals are to feed our nations. Our goals are to advance on climate issues. We start from our goals, and then we design the trade policies that could make that happen. I think it's important to remember that the rules we have are one set of rules. We don't have to do it this way. We could explore other ways of doing it and do it in ways that are more transparent. Often in the trade negotiations, we get very little information. Even those of us who are meeting with USTR, most of those meetings, we tell them what we want, what we're advancing. They sit there like cats, and then they say, see you next time. So we get very little information, and it should be a transparent process that involves stakeholders. On food and agriculture issues, I think there's, as Jim was describing, different ways to approach it. One thing I would say too, though, is we hear a lot about tariffs lately, as if tariffs are always a terrible thing. There are cases when tariffs can be really useful, and I think we shouldn't forget that. In Canada's system, that system of matching supply and demand would not work without the trade restrictions, because they'd just be flooded with the cheap imports from the United States. So on the other hand, if we think about trying to increase, say one of our goals is to grow more fruits and vegetables in the United States, a lot of that's going to be farm bill programs that need to change. But on the trade restrictions, there might be some tariffs, but the tariffs by themselves are not going to fix anything. Tariffs in a system like Canada's that say, okay, here's what we're doing, we need the space to make this work, might be a possibility. I think getting back to those kinds of solutions, balancing supply and demand, building up national production everywhere. It's not that we wouldn't trade, but that trade wouldn't be driving those decisions. And I think also just, so I think those would be some main issues. So getting at agreeing first on what our goals are, having a participatory, transparent process to get at this. I mean, there's ways you could do this. They could have, after each negotiating session, they could say, here's what we did, or before the negotiating sessions. There are practical ways this could happen. And then learn from what's worked in different places, what hasn't worked, what could we do differently, but start from our goals.
Can I just, this is a question that's vexed me for a while. You are the two best people to ask to ask this to, which is, look, let's imagine that process existed. One of the things we don't grow here is bananas, and people tend to like them here. It's the thing Walmart sells the most of, and yet the countries that grow bananas were made that way by quite a lot of violence and US imperial power and debt and a range of other things. So if we continue, and there's no way we can grow bananas in this country, so we have to import them if we want them. And there's quite a lot of internet debate for people who are very online about whether bananas belong in some sort of future post-revolutionary diet. And I'm wondering what y'all think about this, because ultimately the stakeholders in the banana question are not just us in the United States, but also the people who would like to do something else other than grow bananas, but still have a dignified life and find themselves growing bananas because there's no other economic alternative because of the conditions that the US, among others, have been responsible for. So I wonder whether part of our goals must be to change the terms in which people get to join us at that negotiating table, or if one thinks of sort of a fair trade system, would people in America have as many bananas, or would we have chocolate, or would we have as much coffee as we would like?
I don't think people will ever get as much of a lot of things as they would like, but that's just kind of the way life goes. I seem to remember reading that prior to World War II, Montana produced 70% of its food within the state, which included fruits and vegetables. Now, granted, there's probably a lot of squash and apples and things that kept well, but people now feel the need to have strawberries and asparagus every day of the year. So in addition to thinking about what we grow here to feed ourselves, I think we have to consider that some things just aren't available at different times of the year, at least not fresh, and think about that a little bit. But I don't ever see any reason to say, well, we're just going to have to stop drinking coffee and eating bananas because we can't grow them. That's that's why trade should work. That's how trade ought to work, that we get what we need from other countries and they get some of the things they need from us. And everyone should be able to make a decent living at that. Karen talks a lot about the rules. There are rules, but we need to follow them. We can't just disregard them. And if at some point we say, well, this needs to change, then we need to negotiate. We need to be transparent and talk about it and say what's going to work to benefit people, not just corporations and the people constantly looking to get richer and richer, whether they're, people like Jeff Bezos and whoever else seem to think that there just isn't enough money in the world to make them happy.
Karen?
I agree with all of that. I guess when you talk about bananas, it struck me, for example, it is a vexing question, because the dilemma is, in this country, maybe we would say, they should meet all these different conditions. There should be no child labor. There should be produced in environmentally friendly ways. But it matters how that plays out in that country as well, even though we share those values. And so in that case, for example, I know there is a whole association of producers of bananas in South America, who have laid out what they think the terms should be for that kind of trade and production. And so I think it matters who's at the table when we're making these decisions. And I think that is one of the key issues. Like, how does this work, say in Ecuador, if we make conditions on bananas? Like, what do they have to say about it? And so they would have to be at the table as well. So I think that's one of the key issues. Also, I suspect, as if we were to strengthen local food systems here to grow more of our own fruits and vegetables, we certainly wouldn't stop drinking coffee. I'm not going to do that. But I might start valuing more of the things that are grown locally, and be less interested in having, avocados year round, whatever it might be. So I think there's that too. I think what we eat might change as well. But I think getting at that frame of like why we're eating these things, who produces it, who has a say, are really important.
Well, and I think another point, while we don't consider bananas to be a commodity because we don't grow them, the vast majority of the bananas in the world are one variety that was developed because people like it. I think it's the Cavendish. And, we could be just one plant disease away from not having bananas. And I think that goes to what Karen was saying about bringing producers into the conversation, because there may be types of bananas that they would like to grow, but there's no market for them on the international trade system. So in addition to just thinking about what people want to buy, I think we need to consider what farmers feel confident in growing. And that can go back to the debate on seeds. There's a lot of seeds that farmers in other parts of the world use to feed themselves that big corporations would like to patent and draw certain things out of, not because they want to help people, but because they want to make money by selling these genetically modified seeds. So again, in my mind, it all comes back to making profit and not really thinking about what's most beneficial for people or the environment.
I love that. And I think, if one's thinking about this banana conversation, how different would it be if, say, the banana workers rather than the banana producers were at the table? And if they, and if the people who were displaced off the land before any of this happened were at the table? I think, that there are ways in which the democratization of this conversation is absolutely at the heart of what we've been talking about today. And so that may be a great way of leaving us today, is actually just to be thinking a little bit more with the idea of democracy. And in order to have a good democracy, we need good information. So Karen Hansen-Kuhn, where can we find more of your thinking and IATP's thinking? What's a great way for people listening right now to be able to find out more about where you've been writing about this, and how it is that if they listen in time, might be able to follow the rulemaking process around the USMCA?
Well, certainly look at our website. It's iatp.org. We have materials on trade. We're doing a lot of work on climate change and agriculture, as well as on local food systems. I think the National Family Farm Coalition has some really great information as well. That's nffc.net. These things keep evolving, but those are both I think, good sources of information.
And do you have any parting words for our listeners today?
Get involved. Follow this USMCA debate. I think it's going to raise some really interesting questions about why we trade and what the rules should be.
Fantastic. Thank you, Karen. And Jim, I mean, again, your reputation precedes you, and everyone on this podcast knows who you are already. But nonetheless, if they want to follow more of your writing, more of your thinking, and more of the work that you do, where should they go?
Well, Karen mentioned the NFFC website, which has some stuff, and Family Farm Defenders, familyfarmers.org. Yeah, I guess I'd just say that as my parting words, that, like Karen, get involved, which means researching, trying to figure out where your food comes from, buying the things that you like the idea of farmers making a fair wage for, shop locally as much as you can, and get out and vote. We criticize the administration. Well, they were voted in, they can be voted out. So I think that's one of the most important things you can do. The word democracy has been mentioned several times, and that goes right to the heart of it. Voting, protesting what you don't like peacefully, and trying to make changes.
I love it, Jim. Thank you. Yes, I mean, the idea of voting is the last and most boring part of democracy. All the other stuff, the organizing, the teaching one another, the sharing of this podcast is where democracy really happens. So that's an appropriate point to say thank you very much for listening to the Family Farm Defenders podcast. And for more information about the Family Farm Defenders, please visit familyfarmdefenders.org. And again, thank you, Karen Hansen-Kuhn and Jim Goodman, for a wonderful conversation. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Raj.
Thank you.